All right, so welcome back. Let's continue with our Decision Neuroscience lecture, Decision Neuroscience seminar. So before we start, as usual, we have the Decision Neuroscience warm-up. So think about for a minute, what have we discussed from the last time? So what we have discussed from the last time? The topic of the last week, it was about motivation and emotion in decision making. So when talking about emotion, and we talk about that it's quite difficult to have a conclusive definition within the field. But what we know is for emotion, there is a quite important concept which is called the valence. So emotion can be categorized by valence. It can be positive or it can be negative. Positive valence, it can be reward, for example, and a negative valence, it can be just punishment, something aversive, if you may. And then the next topic we talked about last week, it was about motivation. So motivation is basically trying to answer why this behavior. So why do we go to the supermarket, why we eat, and why we watch football games, something like that. The motivation and emotion are quite important in decision making, and it is important when we make decisions on our own. It can also be important when we make decisions in a social context. So today's topic, it will be about social decision making. So before we actually start my part of the introduction, so I would like to ask you, you can write down in the chat window in the chat box. So what do you think, what in your mind is social decision making? So you could give me some examples of what are social decision making. You can also tell me in if you can speak if you want to. So what are social decision making? What is the social part? Which is social? So this is the question, right? So what makes social decision making distinct from making a decision on your own? So this is the question, and you can just give me some answers. What do you think can be categorized as a social decision making? So great, I see quite a few responses. Some say conformity and moral decision making, making decisions related to other people, decisions in social context, decisions that are influenced by other people, and culture of a certain person influence system. Yeah. Any other? Altruistic decision. Yeah, good. Decisions made in a group. Yeah. Right. I think most of you do have a good understanding of what social decision making is. So a few of you mentioned that social decision making basically means the decision involves not only one but multiple people. When there are multiple people, this means there's a group, right? So there are some social partners, there's social other. There is one agent, which is yourself, and then there's another agent or multiple agents that is another. And how your decision or your action can be interacted with actions from another group of people or the other. So basically, how your action can be interacted with the social group. There are different types. It can be conformity. Some of you mentioned their decision, the decision from your social partners affect yours, right? And if your decision could make harmful consequence to the other people, do you want to do this? Do you want to execute this action to harm the other people or not? So this is the moral decision making some of you mentioned in the chat box. That's also very good. And on the other hand, on the opposite side, there is the altruistic behavior. So why would you want to help the others? So there's the self part. There's the self part, that is you, and then there's the social partner. There's the others. So why would you want to benefit the others? Sometimes also by sacrificing your own benefit. So those are the different types of behavior that can be happening in the social context. So that's the keyword some of you mentioned also. So great. So those are quite a few ideas of social decision making. So there is also, roughly speaking, not a very good definition of social decision making. But what you could understand in a way is that as long as the decision is happening in a social context, so then the question now is, what does a social context mean, right? So social context basically, in a roughly speaking way, means there are multiple people. There is not only one single person, there are two or maybe more. So at least two people, when the decision involves at least two people, two parties, then this can be considered as a social decision making. There can be two, can be 3, 4, 5, or even multiple, even more than 10. That's also possible. Okay, great. So those are the examples that we collected of social decision making. Good. So there is a question. It asks that, isn't social decision a kind of selfish decision making, only that you need someone else to enact your goals so you are nice to them without altruism? It depends. So this one really depends. Are there any other questions? So this question we can see from the presentations actually. Maybe not now, but week 11, we will have another topic. We will have more in-depth discussion of social decision making to really think about this altruism or some strategic decision making. Other questions? Yeah, no? Good. All right, great. There's one quite important review article. So if you're interested in the subcategories, the different types of social decision making, and also how the brain is related to different types of social behavior, is in particular social decision making, I highly recommend you to read this review article. So it's basically, as I said, summarizes the types of social decision making and the context and the corresponding brain activity. So the neurobiology of reward and values in social decision making. Apart from you read it afterwards, I could summarize that a little bit on the next slide. So I will use this review article as a guideline or roadmap to group different social decision making types. Okay, great. So social decision making, in the paper, there's a table. So here you will see on the table, it says decision making stage, right? Decision making stage. So recall that we talked about decision making can be decomposed into multiple stages. So if you still remember what we talked about, so decision making, the very first step is, if you are a decision maker, I will present you with different choice options. So your first step is to represent what you are supposed to do. So this is to represent the problem you are about to solve. So if I give you two options, you are supposed to make a decision between one of the two options. So this is the problem representation part. And then there is the evaluation stage. So you would estimate or have some expectations which option has a relatively higher subjective value or not, or lower, right? So this is the value part we talked about also quite a few weeks ago. And then when you have the value of each of the two choice options. In our case, we only have 2 choice options in this case. You will make action. So you might want to choose the option that has a higher subjective value. So you make your action according to your valuation. And after making that action, you might also receive feedback. So is your action a good action? Does the action give you a positive feedback or negative feedback? So those are quite a few stages. So let me quickly summarize. You have a problem representation phase, and you have a evaluation phase, and then the action phase. You make a choice, and the feedback phase. So the feedback can be then used to educate your expectation. So here basically is learning, and we talk about learning in 2 weeks. Well, 3, yeah. And anyway, so we talk about learning later. So here is the table, and here it will show us the choice, the stages during decision making. Okay, good. And then let's look at here another table, another title. So here it is target, the reference frame of valuation. So here what that describes is how your decision is interacted with the decision from the others, and also how it is referred, how it is referenced to. Okay, good. And then there are 3 subcategories. So one is value of other people. So in the parenthesis, it says for oneself. And here it says value of other people's experience. It is for the other people. And then the last one is value of social, the norm. So for normative social principle. Okay. So the idea is basically there are 2 parties. One is yourself, the other one is the social partner. You make the social decision. Sometimes you benefit yourself, but also you could also benefit the others, right? Sometimes also the others' choice will influence yours. So those are the 3, roughly speaking, subcategories of social decision making. So let's look at quite other examples. So here, so when it is at a choice stage, you make a choice. It can benefit you or others, right? So here the first example is deciding whether to marry someone. You would quite have to consider if marrying someone is beneficial to yourself or not. So is that a good choice or not to your own? So this is the question. And another is so choosing a school for your child. So you could argue that if the kid is going to a good school, you feel great also. But mostly the choice, your decision is benefiting the children, not yourself directly. And then the last is, so if your action is altruistic, punishment of normal violations. Good. So those are the choice. You make a choice that you might benefit from it, or somebody else will benefit from it, or how your action is related to the norm in general, if there is one, if any. Good. And as I said, there are multiple stages, and here it is the outcome stage. And examples can be if you are smiled at, right? So this is outcome. You receive a social feedback from the others. And then the second example here is empathy with someone's pain, right? So if I shock someone, I do not shock you, I shock somebody else, but you could observe it. So the outcome is not directly applied to yourself, but rather to the others. How would you evaluate the pain that is applied to the other people? So this is the empathy for pain. This is the social outcome. The other is the receipt. So here, the third example is enjoining fair distributions. This is also the outcome of social decisions. I mentioned there is the learning part, right? People could use the feedback to educate themselves to better learn and to make better decisions in the future. And what are the examples here? So for oneself, it can be learning about someone's trustworthiness. So if you are trying to interact with another person and you learn from the action of the others, you use the feedback from the others to learn if that person is trustworthy or not, right? And then your future behavior depends on how trustworthy the other person is. So this is the example here. Second example is learning about someone else's preference. So if you like apple or orange, maybe in this example it doesn't matter. What matters is what the other person likes. And you might learn by observing the other's actions. If there's another person, for example, hypothetically, if that person really prefers apple over orange, even though you do not do like that, if that social preference is violating your preference, but now you have to put yourself into the shoes of the others to learn what the others' preferences are by observing the others' actions. So this is also learning. In other words, we can say it is observational learning or vicarious learning. If you follow the literature, that's the term. So here, the third, the very last one is so changing your opinion to increase social conformity. And this one can also be done by learning, right? You make your action, and then the others make their choices or actions. Do you want to follow or not? And you have to use the feedback from the others to educate yourself, to update your choice behavior. Maybe you want to change, or maybe you do not want to. So it depends on the situations. And there are quite a few studies about that. Good. And in the area of social decision-making, after we have seen the different categories, right? Quite interesting. And what are common research topics? What are common research questions in social decision-making? So here we could have a few examples. So one is advice taking. Do you want to take the advice from the others or not? Do you trust them, right? Second is quite a few mentioned, the conformity part, social norm compliance. Do you follow the others or do you stick with your own choice? And the observational learning, I mentioned that you observe the actions from the other instead of you do it on your own directly. You use the experience from the others to update your own belief. So using the vicarious experience relative to direct experience. Other example can also be pro-social behavior. So why you want to help the other? Do you want to help the other, and why do you want to help the other? So empathy. So I told you the example of empathy. The pain or aversive experience applies to another social partner, not you. But when you observe the others in pain, for example, how would you feel? So how would the brain respond? Some other example can be strategic decision-making. When you play the game like tic-tac-toe, you might want to play the game interactively. So here theory of mind is involved because you might wonder what you think and what the others think and what the others think you are thinking. So those are the recursive theory of mind experience that is quite relevant for strategic social decision-making. Good. And it can also be conversation emergence. So recently there is a trend to study different decisions or behavior in a more naturalistic setup. So for example, if we invite two participants coming into the lab, and then we just two strangers, let's say, and we introduce them to each other, and we just leave them alone, and they could form conversations. And what we do as a researcher is we can just audio tape, we can record what they say, and we could use this analysis of speech to analyze how conversation emerge. Because They are strangers if they are, and we could see how in the naturalistic environment, how this happens, how speech happens, how conversation happens, right? You could imagine some of the conversation, they could go well, so they like each other and they have a lot to talk about. And another extreme is that they have not too much in common to talk about, and then the conversation can be a little bit awkward. Then you use the data to categorize the different types of conversation. Use this one to study social behavior. So this is also quite interesting. Good, and so on and so forth. So social decision, as you could imagine, we do live in a social context, maybe not now in the social isolation period of time, but in general, there's a lot of other people involved when you are making decisions. And then there are a lot of situations where you do have to consider how your decision might affect the others and how the others' decision might affect yours. This happens not only at the choice stage, it also happens at the outcome stage, it also happens at the learning stage. So I do recommend you read the review article I mentioned you quite a few slides before, 1 or 2 slides before. Good. And then if you really go to that review article, and you would actually see there is a big question in the domain of social decision making. And the question is actually, I asked you earlier, so what makes social decision making distinctive? So how does that distinct from non-social decision making? So this is the big question. The big question in the field of decision neuroscience is whether there's a shared neuronal representation or distinct neuronal representation. So I show you here. So one idea is that social happens only in the social domain, and non-social happens only in the non-social domain. Everything is independent. There's no overlapping, and each of them, they have their own pathway, they have their own neural circuits and brain activities, so everything is separated. So another one is there are some distinctions. So here is like, if we make decision on our own, it is clear that I am the only person who is making the decision. And if we are in the social context, then it is also obvious that there are multiple agents involved, not only one person. But maybe the underlying computation or the underlying evaluation, underlying action selection phase, so all the brain circuits that we talked about earlier during the seminar, for example, the prefrontal cortex, for example, the ventral striatum, so they are all reward or value related. In the social domain, do those brain areas also respond to the social context? Okay, so the quick summary here is, one, there is a common currency scheme. So the social and non-social, they share a common currency scheme. Another one is social valuation is specific. It is specific relative to the non-social decision making. Okay, but this is the biggest, one of the biggest questions in the domain of social decision making, and we will see examples today that are the studies that are trying to answer this question. Okay, good. And so far, if you do want to know the answer, what I can tell you honestly is there's no conclusive, there's no consensus. So because some studies, they find social and non-social, that they share the same brain activity, the same neuronal activation, neuron correlates, and in some other paradigms or experiments, they distinct from one another. So it depends on experimental design a lot. It depends on the situation a lot. Maybe in one situation it is shared, maybe in another situation there's no overlap. So then what we are trying to see is to try to find situations where, to find situations when there is the commonality, and to find situations when there is not the commonality. So this is what we are trying to do. All right, any questions?